Across the ring. On my left, fighting out of the blue corner, wearing green trunks, purple and white trim, hailing from Baltimore, Maryland. He weighed in at 135 pounds. He all pound for pound, great.
He weighed in at 227.2 pounds. He holds a near perfect professional record of 10 victories, opposite just one defeat, with 7 of those wins coming by way of knockout.
It's just wild to see after how that first round went.
Nice left hook
there. The right hand. Do not slip to your left on the jab.
It's just a matter of time. He's getting broke down. Whoa. That's a good hook he landed on. Oh!
Overhand right.
A minute 15 seconds away from the midpoint of this fight, and now Davis trying to walk forward.
Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis fight in 2025 was pure chaos in the ring. The undefeated knockout king went toe-to-toe with the YouTube villain, and what unfolded was brutal, shocking, and unforgettable. Did Jake Paul just conquer the impossible, or did Tank Davis expose him in the most violent way possible? Jake Paul versus Gervonta Davis. On paper, it looked like the kind of fight that should never have been allowed. A cruiserweight who walks around at over 200 pounds stepping into the ring against a lightweight champion who built his legacy at 135. The size difference alone made regulators in Atlanta slam the brakes on the original fight deal. They weren't willing to take the risk, but boxing has never been a sport that runs on logic. It runs on spectacle. And that's why the fight was moved to Miami's Kaseya Center, a city that thrives on chaos and entertainment. What we got wasn't just a boxing match. It was the biggest mismatch in recent history turned into a global event. Netflix saw the opportunity, jumped in, and packaged the fight like the Super Bowl of combat sports. And it worked. Millions around the world tuned in, not just to see punches thrown, but to witness what happens when a YouTuber turned bruiser collides with one of boxing's most feared knockout artists. It wasn't about belts, it wasn't about rankings, it was about history. Now, the weight gap wasn't just a storyline. It was a storm. Jake Paul, the problem child, carried a frame that dwarfed Tank Davis. Taller, heavier, longer reach. On paper, it was David versus Goliath, but here's the twist. In this story, Goliath wasn't the natural-born fighter. Jake Paul was the outsider, the disruptor, the wild card who built his reputation knocking out names the boxing establishment never respected. Gervonta Davis? He was the David with dynamite in his fists. 24 wins, 23 by knockout, undefeated, and feared across 3 divisions. The clash was less about fair play and more about what happens when hype meets pure skill. But this fight didn't come out of nowhere. The seeds were planted years ago, and the trash talk was gasoline on the fire. Rewind 4 years back when Jake Paul called out Canelo Alvarez in a move most people laughed at. That's when Gervonta Davis jumped in and famously said he'd beat the brakes off Jake Paul. It was a quick jab on social media, but Jake being Jake, he didn't let it slide. He mocked Davis's height, turned him into a punchline, and used his massive online following to flip the insult into promotion. From there, it snowballed. Tank brushed Paul off as not a real boxer, the same line critics had used since day one, but Paul leaned into it. Every insult, every dismissal, he turned into fuel. The more the boxing world told him no, the louder his fans shouted yes. And the louder his fans shouted, the more pressure built on fighters like Davis to actually step in the ring and silence him. The rivalry hit another level after Jake Paul shocked the world by beating Mike Tyson. What made it fascinating was how different the two men were. Jake Paul, brash, loud, always selling a fight like it's a Hollywood blockbuster. Tank Davis, quiet but cold, letting his fists do the talking. When Tank said he'd put Paul to sleep, it wasn't a joke. It was a promise, backed up by a record of turning lights out almost every time he stepped into the ring. That's why the fight became inevitable. It wasn't just two boxers squaring off, it was two worlds colliding. Jake Paul, the most watched disruptor in boxing, testing himself against a pound-for-pound star who had nothing to prove, but everything to lose if he let the YouTuber get the better of him. The weight gap, the trash talk, the Tyson fight, all of it created a pressure cooker. By the time fight night came around, the world wasn't just watching, the world was holding its breath. And that's how a fight that never should have happened did. Jake Paul's rise in boxing has been nothing short of outrageous. We're talking about a guy who started out as a prankster on YouTube, making wild videos for clicks, and then somehow ended up in the ring with one of the most terrifying names in combat sports history, Mike Tyson. And not just ending up there, actually winning. Now, was Tyson 58 years old at the time? Yes. Did he look like the same Iron Mike who used to send heavyweights into early retirement? Absolutely not. But still, beating Tyson, even a late career version of him, gave Jake Paul the golden ticket. He turned what should have been a gimmick into what he called the defining win of my career. Critics, of course, weren't buying it. They called the Tyson fight a robbery. They said Tyson looked tired, old, and should never have been in the ring with a 20-something powerhouse like Jake. Eddie Hearn flat out called the whole event an insult. But here's the thing. Whether you loved it or hated it, people couldn't stop talking about it. And Jake Paul? He knew exactly how to spin it. To him, that win wasn't about Tyson's age. It was about beating a legend, stealing headlines, and rewriting his place in boxing history. And the reaction was chaos. Colby Covington came out swinging with words, saying Jake looked soft and not a real boxer. Clarissa Shields, one of the most decorated fighters alive, mocked Jake's entire approach, calling it nothing but chaos and hustle. Francis Ngannou, the heavyweight monster from MMA, joked about slapping Jake around just to humble him. And Andre Ward, a retired great, basically told Jake, "Fight a real contender if you want to prove yourself." Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a hot take. But here's where Jake flipped the script. Instead of getting crushed by criticism, he used it like rocket fuel. Every fighter's insult turned into a headline. Every tweet became a soundbite for his next promo, and suddenly Jake Paul wasn't just a YouTuber clowning around in boxing. He was a name that real champions were forced to acknowledge. Love him or hate him, the man created conversations the sport hadn't seen in years. Now was built on grit. Born in Baltimore, raised in a tough environment, boxing wasn't just a sport, it was survival. That's why, heading into this fight, most of the boxing world believed Jake Paul was finally walking into a trap he couldn't escape. Sure, Jake had beaten names like Woodley, Anderson Silva, Nate Diaz, and yes, even Tyson. Paul, the loud disruptor with millions of followers, selling fights like a Hollywood blockbuster. Nobody cared about whether Jake was legit or not. All that mattered was this. Could Jake Paul survive Tank Davis's fists? Or was Tank about to do what he had done to nearly everyone before him? Shut the lights off in brutal fashion? The stakes were sky high, and the answer, as the world would soon see, was even crazier than anyone expected. Fight week in Miami wasn't just a buildup. It was chaos on steroids. The city turned into a carnival with Netflix running promos like they were hyping up the next season of a hit drama series. Billboards everywhere, countdown clocks ticking on giant screens, reporters swarming both camps like vultures. Every press conference was a circus. Jake Paul leaned into his favorite role, the villain. He mocked Tank's height, crouching down in front of him at one point, laughing in his face. Tank didn't flinch. He just looked him dead in the eye and promised one thing: "I'm putting you in a body bag." The crowd gasped, and the headlines wrote themselves. The face-offs were nuclear. Every time they stood nose to chest, because let's be real, Tank barely reached Jake's chin, the tension was electric. Jake thrived on it, barking insults, clowning around, making the media eat it up. Tank barely spoke, but when he did, his words cut like knives. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Experts couldn't agree on anything. Half of them said this was boxing suicide for Tank, walking into a man nearly 70 pounds heavier. Others argued it was the perfect time to expose Jake, finally matching him against an elite, undefeated champion. And then the ring walks. First came Gervonta Davis. He walked slow, ice in his veins, hoodie up, no theatrics, just that cold killer vibe. His music thumped through the arena, heavy bass shaking the floor, but his face never cracked. Pure focus. Every fan knew exactly what this meant. Tank wasn't here to entertain, he was here to destroy. Then Jake Paul made his entrance, and it was like a WWE show broke into a boxing arena. Pyro blasting, dancers on stage, a custom theme song, the whole 9 yards. He walked out grinning, arms spread wide like he owned the building. The boos rained down, but so did the cheers. Half the arena hated him, half loved him, but every single camera was on him. And underneath all the smoke, all the sound was one undeniable truth. Everyone in that arena felt it. This was either going to be a miracle or a massacre. The bell rang, and the chaos began. Round 1. Right from the jump, Gervonta Tank Davis looked like a man who had no interest in warming up. He came out snapping jabs, darting in and out like a buzzsaw. Jake Paul, towering over him, was swinging that left hand like a hammer, but he couldn't land clean. Tank's speed was shocking. Not just to Jake, but to everyone in the building. Within seconds, you could see Jake blinking, almost frustrated, like, wait, this dude's way faster than I thought. By the end of the first round, Tank had peppered Jake's face with 3, maybe 4 flush left hands. Nothing devastating yet, but enough to send a clear message. Size doesn't matter if you can't catch me. Round 2. More of the same. Round 3 and 4, and Jake finally leaned into his biggest advantage, his size. You could see him settling in, slowing the pace, cutting the ring off, and pressing Tank against the ropes. For the first time, Tank wasn't dancing freely, and he was forced to fight inside. And that's when Jake started ripping body shots. Heavy, thudding punches that echoed through the arena. Tank absorbed them, sure, but you could see him wince just slightly. Jake may not have had Tank's speed, but those shots were landing with raw power. Round 5 sparked controversy. Jake landed what looked like a knockdown. A clean right hand that sent Tank stumbling back into the ring. Twitter exploded instantly. Half the arena thought Jake scored a legitimate knockdown. The other half said Tank slipped. Either way, it flipped the energy in the building. Suddenly, Jake wasn't just surviving, he was threatening. Round 6. More madness. The ref kept breaking them up during clinches, frustrating Jake, who was clearly trying to lean, press, and drain Tank with his size. Meanwhile, Tank unleashed a blistering flurry in the final 30 seconds, snapping Jake's head back twice with that lightning-quick left hand. The crowd was deafening now, the kind of roar that shakes your chest. Halfway through the fight, and no one could believe what they were watching. Round 7. This is where the blood came. Jake walked straight into a counter left that split his eyebrow wide open. Blood trickled down his face, staining his white shorts. Tank's fans roared like it was over, but Jake kept coming. Round 8. The tide didn't change much. Tank was landing clean, Jake was absorbing, but the crowd started to realize something shocking. Jake Paul could take Tank Davis's best shots. Every time Tank landed flush, Jake wobbled, but he never crumbled. His durability was shocking even to seasoned analysts. Suddenly, this wasn't just a spectacle, it was a real fight. Round 9. Both men were visibly exhausted. Jake's mouth hung open, his punches slower, but he kept stalking Tank like a heavyweight chasing a welterweight. Tank still had speed, but his power didn't look quite as sharp after eating body shots all night. It became a test of grit. Tank's knockout power versus Jake's size, heart, and stubbornness. The arena was on fire, every exchange greeted by screams and chants. Round 10, the final round, and everything was on the line. Both fighters dug deep, swinging with desperation. Jake's face was swollen, blood smeared across his cheek. Tank looked smaller but sharper, digging into his last reserves of power. Every second felt like the fight could end. And then, chaos. The finish was shocking, dramatic, and unforgettable. Some say Tank landed the clean knockout shot that finally dropped Jake like a tree. Others swear the ref jumped in early after a wild exchange, stopping the fight as both men swung recklessly. However you frame it, the ending was pure madness. A climax that left fans screaming, replaying, and debating long after the bell. What mattered wasn't just who won, it was that the fight delivered a war. 10 rounds of brutality, speed, size, blood, controversy, and pure chaos. The kind of fight that makes legends, the kind of fight people argue about for years. When the dust settled and the final bell rang, or, depending on how you see it, when the ref jumped in or Tank's punch closed the show, the reaction started pouring in like a tidal wave. And man, they did not disappoint. First up, Logan Paul. If anyone was more animated than the Miami crowd, it was Logan. Logan grabbed a mic backstage and shouted, "That's my brother! That's the greatest fighter in the world!" Sure, it sounded over the top, but you could tell it came straight from the heart. Then came Mike Tyson's take, and leave it to Iron Mike to flip the spotlight right back onto himself. Tyson said he was proud of Jake, but in the same breath, he called out Logan Paul for a fight of his own. That's Tyson, supportive one second, stirring the pot the next. He basically said, Jake did great, now Logan, you're next. And that's where the fallout gets interesting. Did Jake Paul finally prove he's more than just a gimmick? For some fans, absolutely. Surviving 10 rounds with Gervonta Davis, taking his best shots, maybe even dropping him depending on how you saw that 5th round slip, that was enough to elevate Jake from circus act to legitimate contender in their eyes. For others, no amount of size advantage or Netflix production could erase the fact that Jake still isn't fighting ranked prime heavyweights. But here's the thing, people are talking about him like a real boxer now. That's progress you can't ignore. On the flip side, what about Tank? Did he risk his legacy by even stepping into the ring with Jake? That's the question hanging heavy in boxing circles. If Tank had knocked Jake out cold in 2 rounds, everyone would have shrugged and moved on. But because it turned into a war because Jake absorbed those punches and made it to the later rounds, suddenly Tank doesn't look invincible anymore. Did he win? Sure. Did he destroy? Not exactly. And for a knockout machine with a 95% KO ratio, that leaves questions. This fight also drew a bold line in the sand between boxing purists and casual fans. Purists hated it. They saw it as a circus, a sideshow, a mockery of the sweet science. Casuals, they loved every second. For them, this was boxing at its most entertaining. Drama, chaos, knockdowns, blood, controversy, everything you could ask for in a fight. The sport has always lived in that tension between art and entertainment, and this fight shoved that divide right in our faces. And then there's the biggest winner of all, Netflix. This was their first major swing into live combat sports, and they knocked it out of the park. Millions streamed the fight worldwide. Social media clips dominated feeds for days. They didn't just air a boxing match, they reshaped the business model. Traditional pay-per-view numbers are collapsing, but Netflix proved that live streaming mega events is the future. For boxing promoters everywhere, that's both terrifying and exciting. So what does it all mean? For Jake Paul, it means respect he's never had before, even from those who still roll their eyes when they hear his name. For Gervonta Davis, it means a legacy chapter that fans will argue about forever. For boxing, it means a crossroads. Is this evolution or is it a circus? That depends on who you ask. But one thing is undeniable. On November 14th in Miami, the sport of boxing didn't just get another fight. It got a cultural earthquake. So here's the $1 million question. Or let's be real, the $100 million question. What's next? Because if you think Jake Paul is going to ride off quietly into the sunset after this circus of chaos, you don't know Jake Paul. But then, there's Logan Paul. Because as soon as Mike Tyson gave his post-fight hot take and basically said, Logan, you're next, the internet exploded. Suddenly, we're staring at the possibility of Logan Paul fighting Mike Tyson while Jake calls out Canelo. That's not boxing, that's the Marvel Cinematic Universe of combat sports. Logan was already ringside, hyping Jake like a proud older brother. You can bet your last dollar he's not gonna let Jake hog the spotlight for long. And if Tyson really wants to go through with it? Oh man, that's a Netflix sequel waiting to happen. Now let's not forget the MMA crossover chaos waiting in the wings. Francis Ngannou, the man who punches harder than a Ford Escort going 40 miles an hour, has already chirped at Jake. He mocked the Tyson fight as a robbery and said he'd happily slap Jake 2 or 3 times if they ever crossed paths. Then there's Colby Covington, who's been itching to drag Jake into a dirty boxing cardio killer war. The MMA crowd wants their piece of this circus, and Jake has made a career out of saying yes to everything people claim he can't do. And what about Tank Davis? Does he run it back? Or was this a one-time freak event, a sideshow that both men walk away from, never to revisit? Tank's pride might demand a rematch. After all, his aura of invincibility took a hit just by Jake surviving. But his team? They might say, forget it, move on and go back to defending real belts against real lightweights. The business of boxing is cold, and sometimes pride has to take a back seat. But no matter what happens next, here's the truth. This fight already changed everything. Paul versus Davis wasn't just another celebrity stunt. It wasn't just a payday, it was a cultural flashpoint. Netflix reported historic streaming numbers. Millions worldwide tuned in, from hardcore boxing junkies to people who hadn't watched a fight since Tyson bit Holyfield's ear. Social media went nuclear. Hashtags trended for days. Celebrities who don't even know what a jab is were suddenly boxing analysts on Twitter. That's not just a fight, that's a moment. And whether you loved it or hated it, you have to admit, this shook the sport to its core. For some, it elevated boxing, pulling new eyes, new fans, new energy into a sport that's been dying for mainstream attention. For others, it damaged the sport's credibility, turning it into a circus act where size mismatches and YouTubers sell more tickets than champions defending their belts. Both sides have a point, and maybe that's what makes it so fascinating. Because think about it, boxing purists will argue this was the death of legitimacy. Casual fans will say it was the most fun they've ever had watching two people punch each other in the face. And Netflix? They don't care which side you're on, they just care that you were watching. So now we're left with the ultimate question. Did Jake Paul just make history, or did he just break boxing? Was this the fight that proved he's more than a gimmick, or the fight that exposed how far the sport is willing to go for money and clicks? Maybe it's both. Perhaps this was boxing's version of crossing the Rubicon. No going back. The sport can no longer pretend Jake Paul is just a sideshow, because whether you boo him or cheer him, he's the most watched disruptor the sport has seen in decades. So yeah, maybe you hated it. Perhaps you loved every second. But one thing's for sure, November 14th in Miami wasn't just a fight, it was the night boxing changed forever. And now, the only question left isn't if Jake Paul will fight again, it's who's crazy enough to be next. Like this video and hit the subscribe button to get more updates.